Welcome to BrainBox, a podcast for your noggin. BrainBox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that strengthens communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. You can check out all of our programs at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll. In this episode, we're going to talk about ways to use philosophy in everyday life. Our guest is Dr. Guy Crain, a philosophy professor at Rose State College in Midwest City, Oklahoma. Dr. Crain has taught collegiate-level philosophy for over 8 years. He completed his master's and doctoral degrees in philosophy at the University of Oklahoma. His areas of specialization are normative ethics, applied ethics, and the ethics of violence. Dr. Crain has served as a panelist on several discussion panels concerning social and political philosophy and current issues. He's also the author of the open-source philosophy textbook, Introduction to Topics in Philosophy. His current research interests include cognitive and moral psychology and their impact on critical reasoning. So welcome, Dr. Crain. Thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
It's an honor to talk to a philosopher at this point in our nation's history and this kind of these weird circumstances we're living in. We try to hit all the humanities areas in our podcast here. We've had historians, art historians, cultural studies people. We've only had one other philosophy professor, so it's really great to be able to talk about philosophy with you here today.
I'm glad to do it.
So I wanted to ask first, just do you think people are sometimes just kind of intimidated by the idea of philosophy or studying philosophy, or do you find people consider it, I hate to say this, but kind of irrelevant or boring?
I think that the bigger worry there, I experience sometimes students who have that intimidation factor, but I think the bigger issue on the table these days is that irrelevant issue. And I don't think that philosophy is unique in this regard. I think in virtue of the fact that philosophy flies under the flag of liberal arts, all of those sorts of fields are being charged with this sort of a view that, like, look, what are these things even for? And the pressure that puts higher ed institutions in, we really can see that recently in a lot of colleges who've really gutted their liberal arts departments, under pressure from people who basically think of, say, higher ed institutions really should be more and more like job training centers or something like that. And I mean, it's not as though there's nobody who disagrees with that. I mean, some people have really pushed back hard about that. I saw a piece in the New Statesman by Zena Hitz, and in that piece, Hitz argued quite vehemently, like, this is just the worst. It's terrible. We should never equate higher ed institutions with, job training centers. And the claim was made to be something like this: if we start calling colleges and universities job training centers, we might as well be calling them places where you just learn how to follow somebody else's orders. And while I think I sympathize with the kinds of worries that Hitz has, it strikes me as a bit alarmist and too quick. Education could be used to breed conformity or submission, regardless of whether we call it job training or not. And, but also, like, learning how to take somebody else's orders, I feel like that's a vague charge. I mean, I don't know tractably what we're supposed to say. I mean, in my job, I have to take orders, but I have a wide range of freedom to pursue what I take to be very meaningful work. But the orders I have to take, I need to learn how to take them well, or I won't have the job anymore. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Having said that, I mean, I think that people like that who worry about this issue, what they really have in mind is something like that. Hey, look, higher ed institutions are supposed to serve this sort of like societal or cultural purpose where we, breed really good educated citizens who are informed, who have certain degrees of reasoning capacities, and maybe, the autonomous abilities to use those capacities in political participation, to cultivate people who are, round in their cultural exposures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't disagree with that at all. I'm extremely sympathetic to that view. But I think that the mistaken assumption there might be something like, if we start giving any ground to this sort of like job training worry, it's just a zero-sum game. As soon as we do that, we've already given up this other purpose. And that's a view I don't share. I think that it's I don't know, maybe I'll say short-sighted to think that we can just dismiss the fact that tons of students who enroll in higher ed, they individually have this quote-unquote job training purpose in mind. I mean, they at the very least are hoping that they're graduating from such institutions broadens their professional opportunities. And I don't know why, a college can't do both. And part of that is because I think that the people who are pushing right now on this job training aspect probably just have a really bad idea, number one, of like what college is, but also of what job training is, right? People occasionally, especially not just philosophy, but liberal arts are, they scoff at this because they think, look, when am I going to use this in real life? What are you going to do with a degree in philosophy or whatever? And there seems to, underlying that seems to be the assumption that like, oh, what I should do is I should go to college and I'll go to a classroom and I'll sit in this classroom, and what I do in that classroom will precisely mimic what I would be doing at a desk on a job site or in a meeting room in a job site. And really, like, almost none of college is like that. I mean, there's some of colleges like that, right? You can take an accounting class and learn how to use QuickBooks, or you can, take a radiology class and learn how to use an X-ray machine. But those kinds of classes in colleges, those are the exceptions and not the rule. And I think it's important not to give ground on that, because I think the idea that even a job that I would want, a job that would pay well, the idea that a job is just going to be like the performance of extremely repetitive, rigid skill sets over and over again, that's really outdated. I mean, there was a time in American history where, like, yeah, that's probably the kind of job that you're going to get, that's going to feel in either a blue collar or white collar fashion, very assembly line, very rote, very repetitive. But I mean, given that information gets more freely accessible by the minute, we really don't need a workforce with those kinds of limited, narrow skills so much as we need people with these like broad range of much softer skills, more global, adaptable skills where these people can on the fly figure out how to take what they know how to do and do it in environments and situations that they might never have encountered before. Well, you can't really like rote and rigidly practice for that. You have to have those sort of like meta level, softer skills, general problem solving skills, general information analysis, general perspective taking, empathy. Listen, my wife works in IT, and it's crazy to hear her stories because this is what she does too. There's currently like this lucrative industry in IT for people who have expertise in organizational psychology. These people, yeah, seriously, these people get hired to organize teams of software developers and business analysts in such a way that those people have to learn better communication skills, more self-awareness, more emotional intelligence, all these things that software developers and business analysts, these were not things that they were learning in their like coding classes, right? And these are the exact skills that you do get from like humanities classes, liberal arts classes, philosophy classes. And look, here's a case where like IT departments want people like that. And these people get paid six figures. Again, if you don't mind, this is a rant of mine. I hope you don't mind. I'm going on a bit.
No.
Well,
we find at Oklahoma Humanities, we find ourselves having to explain the value of the humanities quite often. So this is a huge contribution to that discussion. Thank you.
Well, good. I just a couple other things along this line. I mean, I think that people take their stereotypes about this way too for granted in terms of like what the evidence actually suggests. In other words, I just think like, oh, especially like, people of older generations who think like, oh, my job was like this. Now my kids are going to college, so I expect them to be trained to do the kind of work that I had, my very first job. And there's just a sense in which like, no, there are different skill sets that are required given a very changing sort of workforce landscape and what people actually do from 8 to 5 or whatever. So there was a survey put out in recent years by the Hart Research Associates. If you want, I'll throw you a link and you can throw it up on on the website.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, these folks asked companies. It was over 300 companies. It was a survey, and they sought out companies who hire a significant amount of college grads. And what they asked these people was like, look, you hire college grads and you have experience with them being in your workforce. Given that experience, what do you wish college did a better job at training people to do? And what was really shocking about that survey is how much people agreed. 300 employers, so like 90% of them agreed that they wish college grads had better written and oral communication skills. And it was like over 80% wanted to see better analytic reasoning skills. And 75% wanted to see better problem solving skills. And 70% wanted to see more creativity and more innovation. There was way more than that. I'll stop there. But the point is, here's the people in the companies who actually hire people for jobs and will cut those people checks. What do those companies want? Well, I mean, according to a survey like this, it sure sounds like what they want is folks who have strong liberal arts educations to actually get those exact sort of soft skills that these companies are saying would pay off, would be lucrative, would help them be more profitable. Somebody who's worked on this recently is a guy named David Epstein. I think he's a sports writer, but recently he wrote a book called Range. The subtitle is Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And I won't go into a lot of the details, but I mean, he covers a lot of the recent social science and econ, and then just some anecdotal evidence that people who get broader educations, who are exposed in their educations to numerous fields and dip their toe in a lot of places, even if they end up specializing in a particular spot, those people who become generalists via their education, long-term, they fare better career-wise, pay-wise, promotion-wise, et cetera. Point being, when am I going to use this in real life? Well, according to these employers and according to David Epstein, like every day on the job, right? I don't know if you saw this or not, but there was a story a couple days ago that Google is going to start offering professional certification programs for project managers and so forth. And it's interesting to me that, the private market is stepping up in terms of like, look, what these colleges might not do, will do. But I mean, if Epstein's, if the stuff that he covers is right, it sounds like even those people studying at places like Google would benefit from at least some liberal arts training. And that
a
Google
humanities
would be
department at Google.
Hey,
yeah. Right. Huh. Well, thank you for mentioning that, man. I did want to ask you early on too, just how could we understand, what's a working definition of the word philosophy, the study of philosophy? How do you think of a good definition of that? It's kind of for a general audience.
Okay, good. I like to define philosophy like academically or vocationally or institutionally. So I think of philosophy as the study of metaphysics, epistemology, or ethics using primarily conceptual tools of analysis. So whereas, say, economists are studying the market exchanges between individuals, philosophers are studying one of these three big fields. Whereas, say, psychologists and biologists are using empirical means to conduct their studies, philosophers largely use conceptual, analytical means to conduct their studies. So what are those subfields? So the field of metaphysics is the field that concerns the ultimate nature of reality. If you want to say like physicists are doing one level, metaphysicists are doing that next level. When physicists say like, well, here's how this event affects another event, metaphysicists are worried about issues like, well, when you say that, physicist, what does the word event even mean in that sentence? Do we have a tractable definition of that that's underpinning the work that you're trying to do? Probably one of the more interesting questions in metaphysics is like the philosophy of mind. So how do we understand consciousness? What is the nature of the mind and consciousness? And a lot of those folks work closely hand in hand, say, with neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, et cetera, to try to understand a lot of those questions. So that's metaphysics. Epistemology is the study of beliefs, evidence, logic, the practice of using evidence to support our beliefs and how that ought to go. Those are the kinds of questions. So how ought, say, a courtroom be structured so that we have a greater chance of getting at the truth and having fewer false positives or fewer false negatives. This is like social epistemology applied at, how do our institutions go about being designed so that we have a better chance of having more true beliefs, less false beliefs, etc. Ethics is, what it sounds like. What is the nature of right and wrong? What is right and wrong? How are how are values to be arranged? What should be our, highest guiding values? So within ethics, there's like meta-ethics, where meta-ethicists worry about the nature of ethical properties. Like what even is rightness? What even is goodness? What are we after with those kinds of words? Normative ethics is this idea of like, okay, how are the rules like arranged? How is the system of ethics arranged so that I can use it now to like guide my actions? Is it rule-based? Is it like character virtue-based? Am I just looking for certain consequences of my actions? Those are normative ethical concerns. And then applied ethics is like what it would sound like. Is it wrong to perjure yourself if you're under threat? Or is euthanasia always wrong? So that would be ethics broadly. Now, for all of those, there's ways of doing the philosophy of ... just about anything. So there's, the philosophy of education, the philosophy of art, the philosophy of science, the philosophy of psychology, the philosophy of psychiatry. All of those fields are ways in which philosophers, interdisciplinarily go to one of these other fields and worry about either metaphysical, epistemological, or ethical questions within that particular field, right? So philosophy of education, if I was, being an ethicist, if I was also interested in philosophy of education, my concerns might be in a classroom, what sorts of paternalistic practices are okay or not okay, right? What sort of pedagogies have good payoffs but actually have some harms involved? Is that okay? Is that not okay? Now I'm doing ethics, but I'm also trying to advance education. And so lots of philosophers do lots of interdisciplinary work. In fact, down at the University of Oklahoma, there is the Institute for Human Flourishing. And that is a collaboration between the philosophy department, the psychology department, and the education department. And their goals really are to use the strengths of all three fields to sort of develop curricular methods that would greatly enhance sort of, the outputs for students. Smarter students who have broader success in a wider range of fields. And the idea is like, you got people there doing the conceptual work, the philosophers doing the experimental work, the psychologists, and then doing in the gritty classroom work, the education part. This is the kinds of things that, philosophers do.
Well, one area I know that you're interested in that I wanted to ask you more about is the ethics of violence. I was really curious what sort of concepts you get into when studying the ethics of violence.
Okay, so in what very limited work I've done so far, what my concern with violence was interpersonal. So I didn't focus on issues regarding, say, like warfare, state-executed violence, no large collective forms. I was really concerned about person-to-person kinds of violent issues. All right, so even within that regard, what really concerned me was this idea of how we respond to interpersonal violence. Like when people are put in relevant situations, what are the ethics like there? What ought people to do? Okay, I argued that, broadly what I argued was that in situations of attack, whether that's, say, like I'm being attacked or I'm witnessing someone else, I'm the bystander witnessing the attack. There's lots of cases like that where, yes, it seems like I ought to commit defensive violence against an attacker for my own sake, for the sake of the victimized party, whatever. I argued that there are, in exactly those cases, alternatives to violence that are not only effective at quelling violence, but do a better job at giving us more of what we want. So I'll just give you a couple examples that I mentioned in my work. One case I talk about was a lady named Antoinette Tuff, who in Georgia managed to subdue a potential school shooter. And by subdue, I don't mean in the physical sense. I mean get him to relinquish his violent intentions by literally just having a conversation with him. He was gun wielding. He was threatening. It seemed as though real people were going to be harmed imminently. And she just continued to talk to him very empathetically and kindly. And very quickly, he lost all violent intention. There's another case I talk about where it's right around the beginning of World War II. There was a British missionary named Gladys Allward who had gone to China, I think to do work like to, I'm going to get this part wrong, but it's something like was trying to convince locals to stop the practice of foot binding in little girls. Yeah. Well, there was definitely like communication breakdown. She went there not knowing the language super well. And of course they didn't know English very well. So, I mean, it was, immersion, and she found out very quickly where people misunderstood her. Well, one of the ways they misunderstood her is I guess they took her to be claiming to have much more impressive abilities than she actually had, because in this little village that she went to, there was a riot at the local prison. As in the prisoners were going crazy and they'd gotten a hold of weapons, and they came to her and said, like, will you come solve this for us? And oh yeah, I'll get right on that. I'll go fix a prison riot. And she felt under tremendous pressure to like try to do something. And she really did. She waltzed into this prison and just walked right up to the guy holding the axe and looked him straight in the eye, held out her hand and said, you give me that right now. And he did. Right? She didn't have to like clothesline him or body slam him or any of that. I'll give you one other quick case, and then maybe a few rapid fires. But there was Dale, I forgot this guy's name, but he wrote a piece about how he, an American, but he went to school in Japan and got really into martial arts, specifically Aikido. And the whole philosophy behind Aikido is that you're supposed to, like, if you even ever have to use Aikido, that's already a failure. The idea is you're supposed to be very adept at, disarming the situation before it ever gets that far. And he tells a story about being on a train in Tokyo, and the train stops and picks up this really huge guy who is just drunk, just super drunk and violent. And he's already he just barely gets on the train, already starts swinging his fists at people, already starts like throwing kicks at people. The only thing working in their favor is that he's drunk enough to be stumbly when he does it. So he's very not effective. And this guy decides, if there's ever a time I'm going to use my Aikido, I'm going to do it. And he says, look, I've been studying it for 7 years. I have no doubt I can take this guy down. And he basically gets up and taunts the guy, the drunkard. The drunkard sees him and is like, oh yeah, it's on. And before the two can even get close to each other, this old man in a corner starts yelling out at this drunkard, hey, you, come here, I need to talk to you. And as it ensues, this old man just starts like asking him questions, like, what have you been drinking? And I've been drinking sake. And well, me and my wife love to drink sake. And the guy all of a sudden says like, my wife just left me. And he like slouches down in the bench and just cries. And like, it's over. He's not hurting anybody anymore. Wow. I talked about tons of cases like that where murderers and even rapists and gun-wielding people were subdued in these fashions through hospitality, through empathy, through even just indignance, and like zero blood was shed. And so here's the catch though. I argued that practicing those kinds of alternatives to violence is hard. It is not for everybody. Not everybody who even wants to be able to do this would be able to like achieve the sort of, wherewithal, to do such things. I mean, we really are talking about people who maybe really don't have as strong of like a lizard brain, turning on in situations of threat and fear. So what I said though is that, look, for that very reason, the fact that this is hard, not everybody can do it. What I'm not arguing is that people who commit defensive violence are always wrong. Absolutely not. If there are people in situations where that is the best option they have on the table. They are not capable of doing things better than that. That by all means, that's what they should do. I'm not saying any differently than that. But I do think because there are these alternatives, and I do think it's possible for some people to be able to equip them effectively, I argue there ought to be such persons. That was sort of the modest thesis that I argue. And the reason I think that there ought to be such persons is that if we continue to think that fighting violence with violence is our best option, I think that essentially we've allowed violent perpetrators, or at least hypothetical violent perpetrators, to sort of like dictate the way that our lives should be. So let me give you a couple like illustrations. So imagine like, well, it's about to be fall here in Oklahoma, right? I always think of the state fair as the time when the weather changes and gets back to the way that I like it. Okay. So, I mean, not this year, right? There's no state fair. So right. Listen, I'm as heartbroken as anybody. That's one of my favorite yearly traditions, is to eat things that I would otherwise find just immoral to put in my mouth.
Sure. Unethical.
That's right. It's the one freebie day, right? Okay. Well, the weather's changing, and I think like, oh, hey, it's a beautiful fall night, so why don't I leave my window open and like enjoy the fresh air coming through at night? And we can imagine that, like, suppose that very night, like a thief comes in my window and proceeds to steal all my stuff. Well, like suppose that I wake up, my stuff's gone, and I call the police, and look, the thief is caught. It all goes to trial. I'm there in the room while the thief is, standing trial. Imagine how insane it would be for like the judge to say like, no, I want to talk to the person who got his stuff stolen. I was like, I'm right here. What if the judge said like, I really think this is on you for being dumb enough to leave your window open. And you should learn a lesson here by just having to forego your stuff. And maybe you'll learn that the onus is on you to change your behavior, since in fact there are thieves out there. I mean, that'd just be crazy. It's as crazy as thinking I would get up and catch the thief in mid-act and say like, hey, don't take my stuff. And the thief's like, well, you left the window open, so that's kind of on you. It'd be crazy to think I'd be like, well, you're right. Here, I'll show you where the jewelry is. Well, I mean, it would never happen that way. My favorite illustration, though, is trick-or-treating. So we have this like mid-20th century wonderful history in lots of American neighborhoods of this practice where people once a year very openly and broadly engage in this like incredibly hospitable communal act that is super. There's this one night a year we tell kids like, walk up to strangers. They want to give you treats. They're going to love your costume. They're going to tell you.
And disguise yourself first.
Disguise yourself first. Expect candy from people you don't know. And here's a case where, like, for so many years it happened, and it was great. And it's this wonderful part of growing up. And then, right around the mid 70s, late 70s, early 80s, all these sort of like urban legends develop about razor blades and apples, and everybody who bakes you a home good must be trying to put like poisons in it or whatever. And look, as a side note, right? I mean, these just are urban legends. Looking into this, there's one and only one person ever convicted of poisoning Halloween candy. His name was Ronald Clark O'Brien, and he actually poisoned candy for his own child, not for random children. He was really he was trying to get a life insurance policy or something like that. So far as we know, there's like zero documented cases of this actually happening. But what's sad is like that rumor, that urban legend took hold, and now nobody, especially at first, the idea was that's precisely why we don't trust like home baked goods. So if I want to make the kids in my neighborhood caramel apples, or if I want to make them, brownies, what's hilarious, right, is like probably hilarious, so hilarious, it's sad, like sad funny, right? 5 years before that might have been seen as extremely warm, inviting, kind, hospitable. We're a neighborhood, we're a community. And now that everybody like latches on to, these fearful urban legend stories, now anybody who like bakes brownies is seen as like negligent or ignorant at best, and then suspicious at worst, right? And what's crazy, right, is like, again, the only people we don't even have on record doing this, didn't even use baked goods to do it, right? And not only that, like, I mean, I don't know if I really genuinely, my heart of hearts, thought that there were people out there plotting to kill my kid via their homed baked goods. I don't know why I would think that people with prepackaged manufactured candy are just completely exonerated, right? Like, oh, they would never go to the trouble to like take a tiny syringe and put it into the Three Musketeers. But the point, look, I mean, don't mean to belabor. The point is, like, we have this amazing, desirable practice that like bonds a community. So look, even if it was true, even if it were true, even if it, more of these urban legends were true, it seems like a mistake to say, because there are the bad guys out there, the onus is on me and my community to change not only what are like reasonable practices, but desirable practices, morally healthy practices. It's the onus is on me to do that, rather than continue to say those people out there should stop doing that. They should quit even trying to do that. It's weird to say that it's my call. It's my responsibility to stop doing things that really would make for better people individually and communally than it is to say like wrongdoers should stop doing wrong things. So, okay, those illustrations to say, by never opening my windows or never baking goods, or barely letting my kids do trick-or-treating anymore, I've basically said, like, yes, the people out there who do bad things, or even really we're talking about these hypothetical risk of people doing bad things, right? Those people should dictate how our lifestyle should be. Those people should be calling the shots about what we will and won't do. Again, careful. If there really is no other alternative than to lock my windows or not send my kid, if we literally can't do anything better than that, then yes, I would think that's what we should do. But it seems like, no, there are alternatives. That's what I'm saying about this interpersonal violence. There really are things that we can do where not only would doing them reduce the amount of violence that gets committed by perpetrators of violence, but it would also give us these like other desirable benefits, lifestyles, practices, habits, and consequences. So given that we have those alternatives on the table, and given that some people could wield them effectively, I'm arguing that as soon as we just decide, like, no, I've got to be prepared to engage in defensive violence, we hand all our power over to these hypothetical people who are in the wrong, the onus is on them not to be doing what they're doing. So despite all of that, I realize I'm in the literature, I am in an extreme minority position. I mean, the literature on violence resoundingly rejects the kind of interpersonal peacekeeping, or even pacifism, if you want to call it that kind of thing that I'm advocating. And I think that some of that resistance is well-intentioned. I mean, people are thinking about their own loved ones and them getting harmed, or themselves getting harmed. And it's not like I think that those people are wrong-headed. I just think the way that the issue gets argued is still pretty poor. Typically what happens at that point is somebody just puts forward, just describes a sort of violent dilemma, right? I am under attack, or this third party's under attack. And there's little more said in the argument. That's just supposed to settle the matter about, okay, so we're just stuck with that. Well, I mean, I've already argued that there's other things people can do in those situations, but I think it's worse to conclude that settles the matter. I think that as soon as we rely on those kinds of thought experiments where we just isolate one action like that, I think that we really run a risk of misrepresenting ethical choices, let alone the people who make those choices. So, for example, this is the way I like to illustrate this. I think when we conceive of ethical choices as those sort of like one-off, here's the situation as described, you have this limited set of options, etc., we can represent choice according to what I like to call the myth of the voting booth. And I mean this metaphorically. The cartoonish version, you actually go into this booth, the curtain is drawn, you're in this isolated space, you have some voting mechanism, whatever that is. Let's imagine two levers you're going to pull, or whatever. Do you want to pull the left one or the right? But the idea, right, is like you are isolated. Doesn't matter what was going on previous to being in the booth. Doesn't matter what's going on outside the booth. There's just this moment in time where you get to stop. You have complete awareness of what your options are, and you just, pick one or the other. And what I want to say is like very few human choices are really like that. I think it's true. That's the story we tell ourselves often about the way that we go about making moral choices. But I think extremely few of those choices really are like that. Instead,
the voting analogy also presupposes that you've had time to think about it for weeks or even months beforehand before you go into that booth. So,
right. It doesn't, in other words, it seems to isolate a lot of the relevant factors that are playing a role that got you there. And not only got you there, but dictate how many levers are in the room when you do get there, right? So the way I like to think about it is being in a swimming pool. When I was a kid, I had a neighbor down the street at a pool, and we'd play in the pool. Well, his mom and sister exercised in the pool. And the way they did it, that they would, for 15 minutes, they would walk as hard as they could around the edge of the pool. And then the timer would go off. And for 15 minutes, what they would do is immediately turn around and then walk the other way. Well, the idea is within 15 minutes, they've got a current going in this pool.
Oh.
And so that second 15 minutes, it's hard. They're walking against their own current. Well, when I was 8, it was awesome because like they created like a lazy river for us in this pool. And we barely had to try, at the end of that, 13 or 14 minute mark, we barely had to try to like go with it. You could just float, let yourself go. But then when we turn around and they do that, we try to turn around too. They can do it, but we're so little. We can barely fight this current. And all of our effort, even with all that effort, I mean, sometimes we end up like moonwalking on the bottom of this pool because the current's pushing us that hard, even though we're trying to, get forward motion going. And to me, like, there you go. That represents more so the complexity of influences over our choices and the automaticity of our choices. There's so much of the cyclit right now that suggests the way that we actually go about making decisions is extremely automated, extremely not well thought through. We kind of have on the fly rules of thumb to use. And the more that we use them, the more we can inculcate ourselves with certain neural associations and act on them much more easily. And that sort of illustration now applied to violence. Think about how the parties to this debate, by the way, I mean, typically are folks who have like interest in gun rights and so forth. And to be blunt, I'm not interested even in that debate. But really where this is going, like, look, I'm going to post this on social media because here's a case where a law-abiding citizen with a gun saved the day. I am not even remotely saying that that's false. I'm not even remotely saying that we shouldn't be glad that other, the victim didn't die from the perpetrator's violence, whatever. But I think that ethically, it's an extremely, it's a mischaracterization to apply that voting booth model to figure out what we ought to be doing in these situations rather than, say, the swimming pool model. Look, I mean, even in situations like that, bystander situations, nobody just happens to be there. Nobody is just accidentally holding a gun, right? Nobody just, with zero historical choices involved, checks their pocket and says, oh my goodness, there's a gun in this pocket. Where did that come from? The idea is, right, there's an entire series of choices. There's an entire history of choices leading up to that moment that explain why that person was armed and now why that person thinks using a gun is the best way to go in this scenario. Or right, like I told you about the case of the Tokyo train, where that guy thinks that Aikido is the best thing to use here. There's this entire history of him habituating himself into automatically turning that option on. He has that tool. He knows how to use that tool. Boom, he's going to use that tool. This tool did not just mystically appear in his hand instantly. There was this like set of lifestyle choices that are involved. And what I'm trying to shed a light on is that even if it's true that in many situations, for many people, defensive violence is the best they'll ever do, ethically speaking, that does not settle the matter. We can still talk about how things could be better. And if we don't think they could be better, again, we're just saying like the fact that some people will be violent should dictate how the rest of us make not just one singular choice, entire lifestyles worth of choice. So again, don't misunderstand me. Nothing I've argued concerns like Second Amendment rights, or whether people have other reasons to be armed, or whether it's true. So I'm not even interested in that. On my view, some people ought to commit defensive acts of violence. What I'm arguing is that even if it's true that some people ought to commit defensive acts of violence, it ought not to be the case that some people ought to commit defensive acts of violence. And we can imagine scenarios where people might be making the best choice they can, but that doesn't mean they and others shouldn't be doing something to make even better choices available. Look, I mean, even if the best an addict can do is go to the methadone clinic, I mean, drive them to the methadone clinic. I'm not saying that that's false, but I hope anybody would say, like, that addict hopefully will engage in a series of actions where at some time in the future, they have much better options than going, they don't just stay in their state of, well, I'm an addict and that's the best I can do. But no, you actually have worked on that and you have now much better, healthier options. And so I'm saying, yeah, there are healthier options for quelling violence. And there are some people who could do those. And the people who would do those would give us a lot of other things that we want: trust, confidence, freedom of movement. You know, why shouldn't I be able to take a walk at night? That's just silly. It's not my problem that there are people out there that want to do me harm. That's their problem. But we need these people to sort of like model that behavior, lead the way, do the sort of hard work of building those communities. And I don't think it's merely, here's the cutting edge of where I'm going. This is the article I'm working on right now. I don't think it's merely those people engaging in the acts habitually that are going to do the job. I do think that we're just on the edge of finding out how much of our environment also can like shape our behavior. I don't know if you're familiar at all with the work of Richard Thaler, who wrote the book Nudge, but he is a Thaler, and who's the other guy? Cass Sunstein is the other guy's name.
Oh, yeah.
They wrote this book called Nudge, and it's just, so Thaler's a behavioral economist, and Sunstein, I believe, is a law professor, I want to say.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so they put this work together, surveying all of the ways in which seemingly irrelevant features of our environment will actually dictate like the way we behave. So things like whether or not you have a certain retirement plan at work, whether the form that they give you is an opt-in or an opt-out option makes a massive difference to how many people will actually put a lot of money into that retirement account. Same goes for organ donations. So some countries, instead of like having a driver's license system where you have to like check it to say you want to be one, they have the opposite. You have to check it to say you don't. And merely making that default option, already being in it, organ donors skyrocket in those scenarios. This is also why, like in men's rooms, you go and see urinals that have the little bumblebee in the corner of them. I want to say it was the St. Louis airport that actually conducted the study of like levels of spillage. And as soon as they had those bumblebees in there, like gentlemen were far better aimers by about like 40%. I mean, it was just dramatically less, mess everywhere.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So, but what's fascinating, right, is that like the tiniest thing that you don't think matters actually does make a difference to what people are likely to do. And so I'm thinking it's not merely these sort of people who could be moral exemplars in our communities, but we could have communities that already have sort of like spaces designed not to even like bring violent intentions online that might actually make it more difficult, right? What if spaces were already arranged for hospitable scenes, for communal scenes, right? I mean, parks that have chessboards, and there's already good work suggesting that like very well manicured spaces already have a lot less litter problems than less well manicured spaces. I mean, there might be ways in which we could even do community design, I think. I mean, I think even in like Europe, there's places where they put spikes on the ground to like dissuade people from, sleeping there. You got to think like it's not merely people's behavior. That right there already gives me an impression about what my script should be right now in the way that I behave. And I think that's what I'm really worried about right now. How could those things factor into creating less violence, even on the part of people who would otherwise perpetrate violence? Yeah.
Interesting.
So there you go. There was a mouthful, but there's my work on violence. Okay.
Well, I did want to ask you a bit more later on about your book. your introduction to philosophy book. But first, just kind of considering the unusual times that we're living in, I really wanted to ask you how we might use some philosophical concepts to help us kind of understand or give meaning to our current situation. And I was curious if you found yourself turning to any philosophers or any philosophical concepts that have helped you or helped your students in these really difficult times.
Yes. Okay. Two or three separate things. One is it's very tempting for the average person to expect a great deal more understanding, control, and knowledge in a situation like this than is really just warranted for any human. And what I mean especially here is something epistemic, something about our knowledge. I think that, I mean, there's good psych literature to say that exactly when we face hardships is when we tend to want to tighten up, tend to want to feel more in control, to be scrambling for that kind of control. And a lot of control can come from the fact like that, well, we really know what's going on. And I think that's a dangerous cocktail when combined with the fact that what we face right now really is quite a challenge to even some of our best scientific minds whose job it is to deal in these sorts of things, where no one single person whose job it is to deal with these sorts of things knows everything needed to get us vaccines, keep us safe. It really is this communal effort on the part of our experts to figure out how to get us out of here. And yet, given news headlines, whether they be sensational or not, I can really develop the poor impression that I know a whole heck of a lot about what's really going on and what needs done, when, you know what, I'm not an epidemiologist, and not even any individual single epidemiologist has all of the knowledge about what should be done right now. And that can be unsettling for people who desperately want to feel in control, that, look, probably the best we can do right now is trust that there are people who know a lot better than us collectively pooling their knowledge and figuring it out. And also that those people are not 100% reliable at all. All I need to know is that they're more reliable than I am, right? So this is exactly why people like to watch Emily Sutton's forecast, right? Or I used to say Gary England, but I mean, he's now retired from Most High Overlord of Oklahoma weather.
Right.
And so I don't know whose name to replace that with anymore. So I go with Emily Sutton all the time. Okay. We like to see that, what's it going to be like? We look at Emily Sutton. She said, well, 70% chance of rain today. And then it doesn't rain. And we're like, well, she was just wrong. Well, no, that's not what that means. What she said was there was a 70% chance of rain. There was a 30% chance that there wasn't, right? So how do I know that she's accurate, that she's reliable? Well, here's how you know. Let's find 100 cases where weather conditions were just like this, and she said there's a 70% chance. Hey, you know what? If in 7 out of every 10 of those cases it rained, she's dead on. She's as reliable as we could ask her to be, right? It would be very eye-opening if I was like, no, she just doesn't know what she's talking about. Okay, well, then I tell you what, self, you start doing a 7-day forecast, okay? And so I try to predict the future for a year, and then I test my record. Every time I thought it was a 70% chance, what did I turn out? Well, if I learned that I'm really much lower than 70%, which I very likely am, right? If I find out I'm only hitting even, I'm hitting coin flip level, just 50%, then look, turns out my local weather expert might not be 100% reliable, but she's more reliable than I am, and that's as good as I'm going to do. And if I think I can do better, then that might indicate that what I really want is a sense of control, a sense of information, a sense of more knowledge of the situation than is realistic to expect. Look, I mean, for better or for ill, science is an institution. I mean, places of research, whether that be in university settings or private labs, who do this kind of work. I mean, as sort of a social institution, the thing is built to move slowly. It is super designed to move at a snail's pace and to be a very conservative institution. I don't mean conservative politically. I mean conservative as in there's not a lot of rapid change, not massive paradigm shifting kinds of changes. No.
Yeah, like steering a cruise ship. It takes miles and miles to turn a giant
absolutely.
ship. You can't do it on a dime.
Right. And yes, and the idea is even the decision to turn around will have to be a collective decision where the person who proposes the turnaround, the onus is entirely on that person's shoulders to make the case. Rather, everyone else gets to take for granted the previous body of work that suggests we shouldn't turn around. And if I'm the person who says like, no, we should. Okay, you're going to have to show us evidence that is persuasive and withstands an entire community of extremely distrustful people to new ideas, and that's exactly why we get the good results that we do from science, because the ideas that survive have been picked to death by people who have an interest in picking them to death. The profession is even rigged so that I advance as a scientist, the more I am able to falsify things other people have done, publish in such a way that I show previous assumptions were wrong, or show how some new and novel idea is wrong. That's a pub for me too. And so the interests individually are rigged such that we do kind of get collectively on the whole what we want. We advance, maybe we only advanced an inch, but that inch is very, very well tested now. And it's hard to deal with sort of like that picture of how science works when we're in a time where, dear God, we need this solved tomorrow. It is urgent. This is scary. If we could have it sooner, we absolutely want it sooner. And now we're expecting this institution that operates optimally when it gets to do it about snail's pace. Now we want it to be a cheetah. And the idea is you're really trading off. There's a big trade-off there, perhaps, between reliability and speed. It could be the case that somebody comes up with a vaccine tomorrow, or even maybe not a vaccine, other like safety measures that nobody knew before, right? But the degree to which those get tested time and time again has plummeted right now because like we're under a lot of pressure, right? Understandably so. And I think so that right there, the concept that I'm very coming in a roundabout way to is a concept in virtue epistemology, and that's just intellectual humility. It is extremely difficult when I'm under a lot of pressure and hardship such that I feel this tremendous need for control, to be the most informed, to recognize that I'm very likely not in a position to really have that level of control, that level of information. And literally the best I can do, perhaps, is to be reliant on people who are in an epistemic situation better than my own. Listen, what's great about the cognitive psychology literature on this is how it calls us out. There's some fantastic literature that just suggests we are terrible overestimators of our own cognitive abilities. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, but the Dunning-Kruger effect, fairly well replicated in the psych literature, is just this: the less you know it. In other words, like, it's precisely when I lack knowledge that I stand the greatest risk of grossly overestimating how smart I am about that.
Oh, wow. Intellectual humility. Okay. I like that term they used.
Which is exactly why intellectual humility is called for, right?
Interesting.
Because I'm running this risk of, when I don't know a lot about a topic, it's, if there's this like scale of knowledge from 0 to expertise, if I really am down on the bottom of the scale, it's precisely because I'm here that I can't see just how huge the gap is. And so I'm going to think I'm doing a lot better than I really am. And lots of folks have run this with like students taking logic tests, students taking grammatical tests, people talking in all kinds of like very objectively measured questionnaires. People just grossly overestimate how well they'll perform on those tests. And sometimes it's bad. People, predict they'll be like in the 80th percentile and they can't even make it to the bottom third. I mean, it's really like that bad. And which is precisely why, knowing that about myself is why if I am tempted to say anything at all, I need to practice being tempted to say, I don't know, like a lot. And you know what? Here's the hard part. I might just have to say, that's okay. It's not as though I really could do better than that. And thinking that I'm going to do better than that is probably going to cause more problems than it'll solve.
We could probably do a whole other episode on the internet's effect on that, like the WebMD effect on making all of us feel like we are competent doctors, but we'll save that for another episode, perhaps.
Sure.
And before I ask you more about your book, I was curious if are there any other books or websites or even podcasts that you might recommend for people, kind of people in the general audience who don't have advanced degrees in philosophy, that might help us get a deeper understanding of some important philosophical issues?
Absolutely. I've got a ton, but I'll just recommend three internet sources and then maybe a book.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I would say hands down, the best and most interesting, well-produced, just fantastic podcast series for philosophy that is so easily consumable by non-philosophers is a series called Hi-Fi Nation. It's put together by a guy named Barry Lamb out of Vassar College. And it's very much, it's done very much in narrative form with contemporary issues. He's done like issues of crime and punishment and criminal justice. He's done tons of like issues like that. And I would say he really does bring up the exact concepts that people with formal training in philosophy should be bringing up. These are exactly how they should be applied. So I don't think any sort of like rigor is sacrificed, but I've never heard anything in there that I thought would have been difficult to follow for any of my freshmen on day one or even a high school senior. It's a fantastic series. I think it's got about 4 or 5 seasons now. Great stuff. The second one I would suggest is a YouTube channel, and it's called Wireless Philosophy. And it really is episodic. So, I mean, you really can just watch one of these and be done with it. And it really does give you an introduction more so to philosophical concepts like, I would teach in a classroom, but I would say in, far more accessible ways. The videos are extremely well produced. They're always hosted and written by a professional philosopher, but then the Wireless Philosophy gets a hold of it, helps edit with the script to make sure it's accessible, and then they get it animated. So the whole thing has got constant animation, diagram, and it really, like, I assign them to my students and they like it. It's not dry, it's not dull, it's done very well, very engaging. Okay, if you want one that would give you a sense of like what it's like to be in a philosophy seminar for people, and let's say you're even the bad kid that didn't do the reading the night before, okay? But there's like some people in the room who did do the reading the night before. The podcast series that really gives you a sense of like, oh, wow, they did the reading so well that I don't even need to have done the reading to like follow this. There's a podcast series called The Partially Examined Life. And it's put out by a few guys who, all of which I think went to grad school at UT Austin for their PhDs, I think. And then just all of them one by one decided professional philosophy, not for me. I'm going to go do something else in life. But they loved it so much that they've kept this program going ever since. If you just really wanted to get your hands on a book, I would suggest a book called Justice by Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel is a political philosopher at Harvard, and this used to be a course that he taught at Harvard. And I think at the time, it had the highest enrollment of any course in campus history. He had like 1,000 students at a time or something, just something ridiculous like that. But he goes through lots of historically up until contemporary times, a lot of the ethical thinkers, and applies their ideas to ethical and even social and political philosophy, policy issues, institutional arrangements, exactly the kinds of things that we talk about now today as a matter of American policy. But he does so in such a way that, like, I mean, I really will get a sense of like what Kant or Aristotle thought, but exactly why that still has everything to do with, say, entrance policies to a university, whether they should just be equal opportunity or affirmative action, or whether there should be laws of this type, or whether there should be, well, anyway, volunteer armies, etc. I mean, it's extremely accessible. I think he does a great job. I use some of that material even with some of my students.
Oh, great. Thank you for mentioning those. And we'll
Yeah.
put links to all that information on the webpage for this episode as well. And tell us a little bit about your book. And I'm curious, first of all, what does it mean that yours is an open source textbook?
Oh, okay. So if I can kind of tell the story about how I got the idea at all.
Yeah.
And then I'll talk about, because that helps the open source bit. So when I got hired at Rose State, I was still in my PhD program at the University of Oklahoma. And so I was still really trying to put together my dissertation so I could finish my program. And in the meantime of having done that, I was teaching with some of the materials that were just already on the table when I got hired. In other words, old textbooks that people had been using before I ever got to the job. And I really didn't have time to rewrite all this curriculum because I was trying to get this dissertation done. And I just, for like 2 solid, is that right? Yeah, 2 solid years. So 4 semesters, I just got more and more frustrated with textbooks that I just thought were not desirable for a host of reasons. And especially because, I mean, teaching at a community college, we have lots of non-traditional students, some of whom, even at community college prices, I mean, college, like they really are reaching out of their, socioeconomic class to be in college at all. And so the idea is like, how can we as educators make the financial bar as low as possible for people who otherwise they're just not going to go to college, even though some of them might extremely benefit from having been there, right? And I had too many times where it upset me that students dropped my class precisely because 8 weeks, 9 weeks into the semester, they still had not coughed up the money necessary just to buy that book. And it was a book I didn't even like, So I got it in my head while I'm doing the dissertation. I got it in my head that, screw it. What I want to do anyway is have a book I really want. And there are some fantastic textbooks out there that I could have been happy with, but the textbook market being what it is, they all would have been extremely costly and just would have created, if not a worse problem in that regard for my students. And so I just got the bug in the ear, like, why don't I just write the book that I want? Why don't I write the textbook that I would want to use in a class? So I won't put any extras. This is like exactly the amount of stuff that I will teach. There's no like optional auxiliary chapters or anything like that. And you know what? I'll just give it to them. I won't be a part of the sort of a textbook industry and try to make
textbook industrial complex. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I won't be charging like $150 for this. And then, because some of those students take classes, they spend $150, $200 on a book. And then the professor assigns like 4 chapters. That just seems, I don't,
but you can sell it back for $5 afterwards.
I just directed a stereotype. I'm sure there are other people who are much more in the middle and have better explanations, but just like that at all just kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth. And so I just decided like, no, I'll write this thing and listen, I won't just like willy nilly think it's good. I'll send it to some of my compatriots and I'll have them give me feedbacks, not to be blunt, not near the peer review I would have gotten had I worked with a textbook publishing company, but some folks that I went to school with and who have tenure track jobs, and I trust their prowess and their ability to tell me, hey, chapter 4 is a piece of garbage and you need to rewrite it. And so I got really good feedback from multiple of those people. And so I've even put it in a second edition. So anyway, I got my dissertation done in the fall of 2016. So really just a year and a half of being at Rose. And the very next thing that I did, just as soon as I was done with that, is I just sat down and started writing this book. And it was a lot of fun. I learned more than I thought I would from it. So a couple of things about this. So I wrote it. It took about a year to get just one draft going. I had some of my English colleagues tear it up for grammar and style. I had some of my philosophy colleagues tear it up, especially in the area in which they work. Hey, will you especially pay attention to chapter 6 or whatever? And then given all that feedback, I wrote up a second edition pretty darn quick. So I would say I even got to a second. It's not long compared to a lot of other textbooks. I got to my second edition within a realm of about 18 months. So from the time I just started to the time, and part of it was, I was using a lot of my old lecture material that I liked So so I had 2 or 3 chapters, already at pretty darn close to developmental stages to just throw on a page. So I got to put together. And at first, here was the bad news, is that it was just one big, ugly Word document. Like, it wasn't in any sense like a textbook that you would think of. And so this was really great. I had the mass comm folks at Rose State. So the professors there and their students who were doing like their capstone work, their job was to take what was just my huge, ugly Word document and make it pretty, make it look like a textbook. So I got cover art, I got formatting, I got tons of images in there, tons of pictures of the philosophers I talk about, lots of diagrams. They did all the pretty making formatting work. They've done that for me twice now. And so now it looks like an impressive, like, wow, this looks exactly like a textbook,
Man, that's great.
A couple of things that I really aimed to do with that I was trying to be different from other textbooks. One was I really tried to write my chapters episodically. So what I mean is each chapter can really stand alone. And I'm thinking, like, I've got a lot of students for whom philosophy is already difficult. And some people can do it well, but I thought it's just not a good approach for me to do the historical walk through philosophy for these people, because I don't want them to get the impression that, if they're lost when it came to Seneca, then they'll never understand this subsequent philosopher 500 years later or whatever. I didn't want them to get, I'm sunk here, so I might as well give up, because we're still talking about some of those issues. So the idea is anybody should be able to pick it up and just start at whatever, chapter 8. And they didn't need to know anything. I don't reference anybody from 1 through 7. It's literally just chapter 8 is its own standalone introduction to that particular topic. So I did this topical approach, not a historical approach, where each chapter could stand on its own, no cross-referencing. It's fine if you felt completely lost on the chapter about freedom and determinism. Maybe you'll pick it up when we get to the chapter on skepticism or something. Okay. Within each chapter, I really did try to hit the historical highlights. Here are the heavy hitters. But it mattered to me to do 2 things. One is to include some of the not traditionally included folks who really did have a voice on that topic. Now, the book that I was using before tried to do that, but I hate to say it, it did it in a very bastardizing way. So they would include, say, Eastern sources when they talked about an issue, but when you actually go look at that primary source, that was not the issue that person had in mind. It's just that if we stretch our interpretation of the words a little bit, we can kind of like allow this person into conversation. And I really didn't like that approach. I mean, in other words, like, if that's worth studying, study it in its own right, based on the issues that person was talking about, right? I didn't do that, but there really are people who get left out of the conversation historically, especially female philosophers. So that was really interesting to me, to try to find ways in which there were these conversations that happened, especially in the modern era. Modern, I'm meaning roughly the late 1500s up until about 1800, 1850, where there were a lot of women participating in the philosophical discussions, but, well, for whatever reason, I'll leave that to people who have other specialties. They were not included in our textbooks when it came time to teach those issues. So I tried to pull those in, but I especially tried to do a lot of contemporary work, because those people are writing in a language much closer to what my students speak. And they can say, here's my view about freedom and determinism. And, my student might be in a better position to understand it when that person working in like the 1970s says it, as opposed to when, like, David Hume says it in the early 1700s in Scotland, right? So I did all that work. I did it episodically. I tried to include a lot more female philosophers, historically speaking. I did it only on the topics I wanted to teach. And then, I threw it up on the learning management system, and now that, people just have it. It's theirs to have. I'm not making a dime off of it. I just have the comfort of knowing I have exactly what I want said in a book that they have to use. Yeah.
Man, that's awesome. Is there a way that our listeners could check it out, or do you have to be at Rose State?
No, I don't mind sharing the link at all.
Awesome. Oh, great. We'll put that link on our webpage for the episode. Thank you so much, Dr. Crain.
Sure.
We really appreciate you being on the show. And You can check out our website at okhumanities.org/brainbox for additional information about some of the topics we discussed in this episode. And we encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/brainbox website, and on social media by using hashtag BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Jeff Mareva, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. This has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.